I was standing in a coffee shop in Toronto when I watched an American customer slowly realize that the laws of gravity had changed. The barista slid a cup across the counter and said, "We're out of oat milk." The American smiled tightly. "Okay," he said, nodding like this was a test. "So just remake it." The barista blinked. "We can refund you." He laughed, a short, confident laugh. "No, I don't want a refund. I want the drink I ordered." She stayed calm. "We don't have oat milk." He leaned forward. "Right, but I'm the customer." There it was, the spell. Back home, that sentence summons apologies, managers, maybe a free muffin. Here, it just hung in the air. The barista shrugged. "You can get almond." He frowned. "That's not what I asked for." She nodded. "I know." A pause stretched. The American tried again, softer. "So what are you going to do about it?" She smiled politely. "Nothing, probably." People behind us didn't gasp or rally. They waited. The American glanced around, confused, as if expecting applause for persistence. He finally sighed. "Fine, refund." The barista tapped the screen and said, "Sure." No drama, no victory. As he stepped aside, I realized something uncomfortable and hilarious at the same time. In Canada, politeness is not surrender, and the customer is not always right. That moment wasn't rude or hostile. It was calm, immovable, and deeply Canadian. And I started noticing it everywhere. Later, I'd see the same scene replay in airports, hotels, and grocery lines, each time with a different accent and the same quiet refusal. This was not one awkward interaction. It was a pattern. And the further Americans pushed, the calmer Canada seemed to become. That's when things really started getting strange. For me there personally, I thought that coffee shop was a fluke. One stressed traveler, one tired barista. But the longer I stayed in Canada, the more I realized I was watching the same play with different actors. I'd hear an American say, "Can I speak to your manager?" And with the confidence of someone pressing a nuclear button. The Canadian response was always gentle. "Sure," they'd say, not rushing. The manager would arrive, listen calmly, and then say, "Yeah, that's our policy. No apology, no override." The American would blink like the floor had moved. I started noticing how predictable the American script was. Step 1, explain the problem loudly. Step 2, explain it louder. Step 3, remind everyone that money has changed hands. "I paid good money for this," they'd say, as if cash unlocked secret doors. Canadians didn't argue, they just waited. Silence became a wall. I'd hear, "So what can you do for me?" And the answer would be, "This." That was it. I'd lived in the US, long enough to know how rare that was. Back home, employees are trained to bend before voices rise. Here, they stood still. Not mean, not smug, just firm. I realized this wasn't bad service. It was a different definition of respect. Americans were trying to win. Canadians were trying to end the conversation, and every time the American escalated, the Canadian slowed down. Voices went up on one side, heart rates went down on the other. That mismatch created this quiet comedy, where the louder someone became, the less power they seemed to have. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It kept happening. Restaurants, stores, airports, same pattern, same confusion. And the Americans never realized the problem wasn't Canada. It was the script they brought with them. And the more confidently they performed it, the faster it collapsed. I remember thinking this was going to explode eventually. Someone would yell back, someone would apologize, but it never happened. The Canadians just held their ground with smiles and policy. The Americans kept searching for the hidden level where authority lived. "Is there anyone else I can talk to?" they'd ask. "No," came the answer. Calm. Final. That calm was the scariest part. It didn't punish. It didn't reward. It simply ended options. Watching it felt like watching gravity work. You could jump, scream, or complain, but you were still coming down. And that's when I knew the next stories wouldn't be polite misunderstandings. They'd be collisions. And those collisions were always louder, messier, and more public. Because once embarrassment sets in, escalation feels logical, even necessary, especially when the old rules fail completely in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar people watching closely nearby. The first mild case happened in a restaurant in Vancouver, the kind of place with a small menu and big confidence. An American guy scanned it like he was debugging software. "So," he said, tapping the page, "can I get the chicken, but without the sauce, and swap the sides and make it grilled, not roasted?" The server smiled. "No." He laughed. No problem?" She shook her head. No. He frowned. "But I don't eat carbs." She nodded sympathetically. "Okay." He waited for the pivot, the accommodation, the moment where effort would be rewarded. It never came. After a pause, he said, "So you can't just do it?" She said, "We don't." He ordered something else, quieter this time. Watching him deflate, I realized Canadians weren't denying him food. They were denying the negotiation. A few days later, I watched an American woman at a clothing store hold a sweater like evidence. "I bought this yesterday," she said. "I want to return it." The cashier asked, "Do you have the receipt?" She didn't. "No, but I paid cash." The cashier nodded. "Then I can't." The woman leaned in. "In the States, they'd just put it back on my card." The cashier smiled. "Okay." That was it. No debate, no sympathy discount. The woman tried a softer tone. "I'm a customer." The cashier replied, "Yes." Silence followed. Eventually, the woman folded the sweater and left with it, muttering. The policy hadn't budged an inch, and no one felt guilty about it. The Starbucks incident was my favorite. An American man waited for his drink, checked the label, and frowned. "This is wrong," he said. The barista looked. "That's what you ordered." He shook his head. "No, I wanted it iced." She pointed to the cup. "It is iced." He raised his voice slightly. "I need to speak to a manager." The barista nodded and walked away. When the manager arrived, the man repeated himself, louder now, adding details like volume might add clarity. The manager listened, nodded, and said, "She made it correctly." The man stared. "So you're not going to fix it?" The manager smiled. "There's nothing to fix." The man stood there, stunned, like someone who dialed 911 and reached voicemail. The last mild case was a Yelp threat in Montreal. An American couple complained about waiting too long for a table. "This is ridiculous," the man said. "I'm leaving a bad review." The host shrugged. "Okay." The man paused. "You don't care?" The host said, "Not really." That answer landed harder than anger would have. The couple left, defeated, not because they'd been mistreated, but because their leverage had evaporated. Each of these moments was small, almost polite. No shouting. No scenes. Just Americans pushing the same buttons and getting no response. It wasn't hostility. It was neutrality. And neutrality is devastating when you're used to escalation working. These were the warm-ups, the practice rounds. Because when Americans realized politeness wasn't cracking the system, they didn't retreat. They escalated. And that's when things stopped being quiet. The airport desk was where escalation met its natural enemy. An American man slammed his passport down and said, "I missed my connection because your delay ruined my schedule." The agent nodded. The weather delayed the flight. He leaned closer. "So what are you going to do for me?" She spoke slowly. "Rebook you on the next available flight." He laughed. "That's not acceptable." She waited. He raised his voice. "I'm a frequent flyer." She typed. "The next flight is tomorrow." He stared. "You're kidding." She looked up. "No." People behind him shifted. No one defended him. He tried again. "I need a supervisor." She said, "I am." The silence after that answer felt heavier than shouting, and he finally stepped aside, smaller, dragging his carry-on like proof he had lost something invisible. Hotels came next, and confidence walked in before reason. At a front desk in Calgary, an American smiled wide and said, "So I'm hoping you can upgrade me." The clerk asked, "Do you have an upgrade certificate?" He shook his head. "No, but I'm a Diamond member." She smiled back. "Congratulations." He waited for the reward. It never arrived. "So, the upgrade?" She replied, "The room you booked is the room." His smile collapsed. "In the States, they take care of loyalty." She nodded. "Here, too." He frowned. "Then why won't you?" She said, "Because we're full." He tried charm, then authority, then disbelief. None of it moved her. When he walked away, I realized entitlement sounds confident until it echoes. The grocery store lecture was louder. An American man waved a coupon and said, "This should work." The cashier scanned it and said, "It's expired." He sighed dramatically. "Come on, it's only a week." She shook her head. "I can't." He launched into a speech. "Good customer service is about flexibility." She listened, then kept scanning. "Do you want the rest of these?" he demanded. She said, "Yes or no." He froze, trapped between sermon and decision. He paid furious, because the audience he wanted never showed up. The line-cutting incident felt almost scientific. An American stepped ahead and said, "I just have a quick question." A Canadian woman said quietly, "There's a line." He smiled. "I'll be fast." No one moved, no one yelled. The line stayed solid. He looked around, confused, then stepped back. Watching it, I understood escalation fails when the crowd refuses to validate it. These moments weren't dramatic. They were methodical. Each one stripped a layer of assumed authority. And with every failed attempt, the next escalation grew louder, because once your old tools stop working, using them harder feels like logic, even when it isn't. I kept thinking escalation would eventually trigger resistance, something sharp, something final, but Canada never took the bait. At an airport cafe, an American woman argued about a charge and said, "This is unbelievable." The cashier replied, "Okay." She escalated, "I'm calling corporate." He nodded. "Sure." She waited for fear. None arrived. In a mall, an American father told a clerk, "My kid is crying because of you." The clerk said, "I'm sorry he's upset." Nothing changed. Each time, the American logic assumed conflict would unlock authority, and each time, calm closed the door instead. The aftermath was always the same. Americans walked away feeling ignored, not attacked, which was somehow worse. There was no villain to fight, no apology to accept, no victory to claim. Just policy, tone, and time. Watching this happen over and over, I realized these weren't customer service failures. They were boundary demonstrations. Canadians weren't saying no to people. They were saying no to performance. Volume, emotion, and insistence were treated like weather, acknowledged but irrelevant. That's why escalation kept growing. Without feedback, people turned the dial higher. It's human. And the higher it went, the quieter Canada became. That imbalance created public moments that felt absurd, almost slow motion. You could see Americans searching faces for allies, for someone to validate the effort. No one did. The crowd stayed neutral, which felt like judgment. By the end of each encounter, the American wasn't angry anymore. They were confused. Confusion turned inward. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. Maybe this isn't working. That realization never arrives gently. It arrives late, after embarrassment, after repetition, after everyone has watched you fail politely. And once that clicks, escalation stops being funny and starts becoming desperate. Because if being louder doesn't work and being nicer doesn't work, the only thing left is to push harder. That's when the stories stop being small. That's when airports turn into stages, hotels into battlegrounds, and quiet lines into tests of ego. And that's exactly where this was heading next. And I could feel the temperature changing. What started as polite confusion was hardening into something sharper. The Americans were no longer asking for help. They were demanding recognition. They wanted the system to react, to acknowledge effort, to reward persistence. Canada refused. It offered courtesy without concession, kindness without compliance. That refusal didn't end the encounters. It transformed them. The next stories wouldn't be about coupons or upgrades. They would be louder, public, impossible to ignore. Because once escalation stops working quietly, it doesn't disappear. It explodes. And the moment that explosion happened, everyone nearby learned something uncomfortable about power, politeness, and what happens when neither side blinks in front of strangers watching closely together. Watching all these escalating scenes, I started asking myself why this pattern existed beyond just personality clashes. Americans don't wake up one morning and decide to yell at polite strangers. They've been trained for it. From early jobs to culture-wide expectations, escalation is rewarded. You complain, you insist, you win. A waiter spills coffee, apologize profusely, get a discount. Order wrong, raise your voice, get free dessert. In the US, a volume often equals leverage, and service systems are built around that principle. Canadians, on the other hand, operate under a different incentive framework. Wages aren't tied to tips in the same way, and employees are trained to follow rules rather than bend them to placate loud customers. Politeness is the social lubricant, not a performance metric. It's not about arrogance, it's about structure. Americans equate politeness with weakness, because back home, politeness is often overshadowed by urgency. Raise your voice and someone will react. Be charming, and you might bend rules. In Canada, rules exist to protect both parties. Politeness isn't a weapon or a trap, it's a boundary. I noticed it most clearly when Americans doubled down, expecting chaos to follow. Nothing happened, no apology, no reward, just calm, procedural resistance. Psychologically, it's fascinating. Escalation is a form of learned problem-solving. If the first attempt fails, you try harder. But when your environment is neutral and procedural, escalation becomes self-defeating. The louder you are, the less effect you have. It's almost Pavlovian. The expected outcome never triggers. Americans are trained to chase an effect. Canadians don't produce it. That mismatch generates cognitive dissonance, which explains the flustered expressions, the muttered threats, the slow realization that shouting won't bend reality. Education and upbringing also play a role. American culture emphasizes assertiveness, negotiation, and advocacy from a young age. Canadians are taught negotiation exists, but with social harmony and patience as higher-order goals. When these two scripts collide, it's like watching two operating systems run the same program with entirely incompatible code. Every attempt to escalate is like pressing buttons that do nothing. And there's a broader insight here. This isn't just about Americans are loud or Canadians are polite. It's about how incentive systems shape behavior. One side expects obedience through persistence, the other expects compliance through protocol. When persistence meets protocol, chaos doesn't erupt, it fizzles. Americans feel powerless because the system doesn't respond to the cues they rely on. Canadians feel normal because the system is working exactly as designed. By the time I noticed it consistently, I started predicting the outcomes. Loud, insistent Americans always hit a wall. Calm Canadians always held it. And each failed escalation became a lesson in humility, not hostility. The psychology behind it is beautiful in its subtlety. Power isn't always about dominance. Sometimes it's about immovable neutrality. That's what makes these encounters both hilarious and psychologically compelling. And once I understood that, I could see why the next wave of stories, the public, emotional explosions, would be inevitable. Because humans don't take neutral walls quietly forever. The first peak moment happened at a cafe in Ottawa, where an American man decided that a missing cookie could not stand unchallenged. He waved his hand and said, "I ordered this with my coffee. Where is it?" The barista looked down at the empty tray. "We ran out." He leaned forward, voice rising. "So what am I supposed to do? Just wait?" She smiled. "You can get another type of pastry." He blinked as if someone had spoken in a foreign language. "But that's not what I ordered," she nodded. "I know." A pause stretched long enough to feel like a sentence in slow motion. "I want the manager," he finally said. When the manager arrived, he repeated himself, louder now, each word carefully chosen to assert ownership over the situation. The manager listened, nodded, and said, "We don't have that cookie." The man's jaw dropped. "So, you're not going to fix it?" "Nope." Silence. The room didn't cheer. No one offered sympathy. And in that moment, I realized something hilarious. The higher the volume, the less effect it had. Power evaporated quietly. Then there was the public meltdown in a bookstore in Calgary. An American woman argued over a pre-ordered novel, waving receipts and citing dates like evidence. "This is unacceptable," she exclaimed. The clerk nodded, pointing to the system. "Our records show it hasn't arrived yet." She shouted louder. "I prepaid, I need my book." Customers glanced over, curious. The clerk remained calm. "As soon as it's in stock, you'll get it." She paused, frustration building. This would never happen in the States. The clerk tilted her head. I'm sure it wouldn't. People behind her waited silently. No one offered a side, no applause, just quiet observation. Eventually she left, bookless, as if someone had pulled the rug from under her confidence. And that's when I saw it. Americans assume escalation will produce a response. In Canada, escalation just produces silence. The final peak story was at a hotel in Toronto. An American man tried every trick in the book to secure a room upgrade. "I'm a platinum member. I've stayed here 50 times this year. Surely you can do something." The receptionist smiled faintly. "The room you booked is the room." He tried charm, authority, subtle threat, and disbelief in rapid succession. None worked. "Can I speak to your manager?" "I am the manager." He froze. "You're kidding." She shook her head. "The room is the room." He flopped into the nearest chair, defeated, muttering about corporate incompetence. And the genius of it was that she wasn't mean, rude, or dismissive. She was polite, steady, immovable. That's when I realized the psychological punchline. The Americans had no leverage left. Every tool they knew, volume, charm, loyalty, threat, failed. And the calm, procedural refusal was itself a form of power. After each of these encounters, Americans retreated internally. You could see it in their body language, slumped shoulders, muttered curses, a faint pink creeping across the ears. They weren't just embarrassed, they were confused. Their usual script had collapsed, leaving a gap between expectation and reality. Meanwhile, Canadians walked away untouched, polite but firm, leaving the American ego suspended in midair like an unanswered question. These peak moments aren't just funny, they're instructive. They illustrate a collision of worldviews. One trained to escalate for results, the other trained to maintain protocol and calm. When these scripts meet, escalation fails spectacularly. Volume doesn't compel, persuasion doesn't bend policy, and witnessing it repeatedly is mesmerizing, a mix of schadenfreude and anthropological insight. By the end of it, you don't just laugh, you understand. The Americans aren't villains and the Canadians aren't saints. It's a clash of logic, incentive systems, and cultural assumptions, and the fallout is as quiet as it is devastating. And as I watched these final moments unfold, I knew the takeaway would be more than funny stories. It would be a lesson in humility, patience, and the limits of assertiveness. After seeing all of these encounters unfold, it became impossible not to step back and see the bigger picture. Across cafes, hotels, airports, and stores, the same pattern repeated. Americans escalated, Canadians stayed calm, and the expected results never materialized. The pattern was clear. Volume didn't equal victory. Persistence didn't bend policy. The more an American tried to assert authority, the more invisible their effort became. And yet, no one was rude. No one was vindictive. Canadians were polite, steady, and firm, a combination that, in its simplicity, completely disarmed the escalation script. It struck me how much of this was about perspective. To the American, these moments were frustrating, embarrassing, and confusing. To the Canadian, they were just another Tuesday, and therein lies the subtle genius. Politeness and boundaries can coexist without conflict. The Americans weren't being punished. They were being neutralized. Their usual levers of control simply didn't exist in this context, and that's why the aftermath felt so strange. It wasn't anger that lingered, it was confusion. The quiet realization that the rules they had relied on for years didn't apply here. Empathy matters too. Americans were not inherently wrong for reacting the way they did. They were trained to respond to one set of incentives. Canada simply presented a different framework. Understanding that makes the humor less mean-spirited and more reflective of a cultural collision. Escalation failed not because Canadians were cruel, but because they operated under a system that valued procedure, calm, and mutual respect over performance under pressure. So what's the takeaway? If there's one lesson buried in these stories, it's this. Authority doesn't always respond to volume, and patience can be more powerful than persistence. The most effective way to navigate a foreign system may not be through force or charm, but by understanding the underlying rules. Americans can learn that a calm refusal is not a personal attack, and Canadians can learn that empathy for the bewildered visitor is its own form of kindness. And finally, the humor itself is instructive. It comes from the collision between expectation and reality, from watching someone operate under a failed script, and from witnessing the quiet, unyielding power of politeness. There's joy in the absurdity, but also wisdom. These moments aren't just funny. They're a reminder that human behavior is shaped by context, incentives, and cultural norms. And that understanding, even amid laughter, is the real victory. So here we are, back where we started, the title moment. Americans expecting applause for persistence, Canadians offering calm, procedural neutrality, and me, somewhere in the middle, trying not to laugh too loudly. It's a perfect snapshot of everything we've seen. Escalation meets immovable politeness, ego meets protocol, and volume meets silence. Think about it. Next time you're traveling, trying to bend the system with charm or fury, remember that not every country responds to your script. In Canada, being loud doesn't earn respect, and insisting doesn't win favors. Sometimes the most powerful move is to step back, take a breath, and understand the rules of the game before trying to rewrite them. If you've ever been in a situation like this, or witnessed someone else fail spectacularly, drop your story in the comments. I want to hear about the moments where cultural scripts collide and leave people bewildered, flustered, or hilariously defeated. It's relatable, it's funny, and honestly, it's therapeutic to share. And hey, if you enjoyed this tour through polite chaos, hit that subscribe button. There's more where this came from: cross-cultural collisions, absurd misunderstandings, and the kind of stories you won't believe actually happened. Remember, in Canada, the customer might not always be right, but they're always being observed. And sometimes that's even more humbling than a refusal. So the next time you expect applause for your persistence, don't. Smile, nod, and let politeness do the work. It's quietly devastating, profoundly Canadian, and somehow completely hilarious.